I've discussed the basis for my moral framework in a more comprehensive video, but here's the short version. Morality is ultimately subjective. It doesn't exist without a subject. In fact, without humans, it ceases to exist at all. From that point, it's a matter of recognizing that most humans share universal foundations for right and wrong behavior, regardless of their society, religion, or lack thereof. Look around. Despite all the noise, most societies on Earth have converged without a shared God or universal doctrine, on the same basic behavioral rules. Don't kill without cause. Don't steal. Don't lie, at least not when it hurts others. Protect the vulnerable. Help when you can. I don't see these as commandments, but survival strategies. They're what you get when a species of conscious social beings try to live together without tearing themselves apart. I didn't need metaphysics to understand why child abuse is wrong. I just needed to be human. No divine revelation required. That's why I use suffering as my starting point. Not because it came from a burning bush, but because every conscious being recoils from it. Pain, fear, and humiliation are universally avoided. You don't need to be taught that. You feel it. However, it's not ultimately objective. The universe doesn't care what I think, or what happens to any of us. It only has meaning within our sphere of humanity. But in that context, it absolutely has meaning, and is valid. That's not what this video is about, though. This video responds to those who say that subjective morality is meaningless and invalid. Yet somehow, they argue that saying, "My moral basis comes from God, therefore it's objective," not only makes it true, but makes it more valid. It's time to look at divine command theory. It's not sound. First, let's address the claim that morality is inherently objective simply because it supposedly comes from God. The problem is that declaring something to be objective doesn't make it so. What divine command theory, DCT, actually does is place the idea of morality in the hands of an unsubstantiated supernatural entity that can do whatever it pleases. So if God says murder is wrong, it's wrong because he says so. Might makes right. But if he said killing for fun was okay, would it suddenly be moral? This presents a huge problem. If God's commands are the foundation of morality, then we're left with a moral system that could be entirely arbitrary. However, it goes deeper than that. Let's say there is a God, and he is the ultimate objective arbiter of morality, and he handed down that moral framework to humans. It still has to be interpreted by humans. Yet religious people can't even agree in the moment on what those values are, let alone historically. Not 300 years ago, Jefferson Davis stood on the floor of the U.S. Senate and declared, "Let the gentleman go to Revelation to learn the decree of God. Let him go to the Bible." I said that slavery was sanctioned in the Bible, authorized, regulated, and recognized from Genesis to Revelation. Slavery existed then in the earliest ages and among the chosen people of God. And in Revelation we are told that it shall exist till the end of time shall come. You find it in the Old and New Testament, in the prophecies, Psalms, and the epistles of Paul. You find it recognized, sanctioned everywhere. It's not as though he was alone, given that he went on to become the first and only president of the American Confederacy, which led to a war that took the lives of 620,000 to 750,000 people. Without some independent standard, how do we know that God's commands aren't the misguided interpretations of religious fanatics? When you examine the common disagreements between religions and even within different sects, they're usually regarding morals. Another flaw in divine command theory is that it removes any personal autonomy when it comes to moral reasoning. If you subscribe to this theory, your moral compass is always tied to the will of a higher power, rather than any intrinsic understanding of right and wrong. This undermines human reasoning, critical thinking, and empathy in favor of blind obedience to a higher authority. Morality should be rooted in human experience, not just a rigid set of rules handed down from on high. We don't need God to tell us that causing unnecessary suffering is wrong. We feel it when we experience it ourselves. The emotional and psychological recoil from suffering is universal, and that's where we should start when constructing a moral framework. In either case, the supposed divine foundation of morality falls apart. Either it's arbitrary, making it meaningless, or it relies on an external standard that undermines the very idea that morality is based on a God's command alone. It's a paradox that leaves believers in a bit of a bind. In the end, we're left with an unsubstantiated claim of divine revelation, filtered through the limited and fallible humans it was supposedly revealed to, and claimed to be objective, just because they say so. Not much of an objective moral code. Then they have the nerve to criticize my moral framework? At least I admit it's subjective and base it on more than what a god supposedly said and meant. Probably the worst of it is that all discussions of right and wrong become centered on what a god said instead of the behavior itself. It's no longer about the impact of the behavior, but scriptural exegesis. To claim that this is a rational basis for any moral code is downright ludicrous. Thanks for watching.